All right. Well, welcome, Nelson. I wanted to thank you for joining us tonight for our art talk. And if we wanted to go ahead and get started and have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your title, where you work, and where you're located.
Sure. So my name is Nelson Fields. I'm a professor at the University of Kentucky. So I kind of have a dual career, if you will. So as a professor, and I've worked my way up I began here in 1996, I believe it was, as like a visiting professor, assistant professor. I moved into a tenure track as an assistant professor, was eventually promoted to associate professor, and then recently promoted to full professor. At the same time, I have also maintained my professional career as a costume designer. I've been, it was a little difficult, because my track was a little bit odd because frankly, when I was in college, I was a really bad student. And so eventually I don't think I was really, I was from a small town in Kentucky. I came to UK. It was, such a big, overwhelming place in the 70s and did not have nearly the support systems that it has in place now for students. And so as a result, I just didn't do what I was supposed to do. I was, but the reason for that was I came here as a theater major and I became very involved in the program. And of course it was so much bigger than anything I had done in high school. And I had opportunities when I was in high school, I thought I was going to be an actor. That was about all you could really do. And when I got here, then suddenly there were all these other things you could do. And what I kind of discovered was I wasn't crazy about being on stage. And so a friend of mine who was a graduate student at the time, she kept saying, you should go to the costume shop. You should go to the costume shop. And eventually I did. And the woman that was down there was she was really crazy, and she was a little intimidating, but what eventually I realized about her was this passion she had for what she did. And that really, there was something in that just connected with me. And so unfortunately what happened was, because the university was so overwhelming, that was a real nice safe space. So basically I just kind of moved in there and I didn't go to class, and I was anyway, eventually I gained enough skills and I just decided it was time to get out and go and pursue a career. And I did. I quit and went out and I got a job working in some summer theaters here and there, and eventually found my way to Texas where I was working for this very large outdoor theater. I was working in the winter in regional theaters. And over time, I began to realize that what I really wanted to do was design, but because I didn't have my degrees, I was limited as to what I could do. And so I realized that to work in regional theater or anything beyond that, you really had to have a Master of Fine Arts degree. So ultimately, about 8 or 10 years later, I decided to go back, finish my degree. So I came back here, finished, and then I went on to graduate school at the University of Iowa, where I got my MFA. Well, by that time I had gotten married and I had a small child. And so when the time came to get out of that, I was looking at professional gigs, but then the woman who was the costume shop supervisor at Iowa, I was teaching as a graduate assistant. I was teaching a class that was called Costume Practicum, which was basic, what is our costume production class. And one day, I think it was the second semester I had been teaching, she pulled me over and she said, have you ever thought about teaching? And I said, no, not really. And she said, because you're really good at it. So that kind of made me, and I at that point, I knew I was going to need a job. So I applied for some teaching jobs and I got one in North Carolina. And then that kind of launched that. And eventually I wound up back here because the woman that I had studied under was retiring and they were looking for somebody. And it was, and I moved into that position. And so because I kind of took a big chunk of time off from my professional career to go back to to go to undergrad and finish, I kind of lost a lot of my professional connections. And so I had to rebuild those. But ultimately, I kind of did start working again, because one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand is when you're a university faculty member, you don't just teach and go sit on committees. You are required to publish if you're in a scholarly pursuit, and if you're like me, working in the profession, you're expected to continue working and designing and being part of the profession. So I was catching, so I began doing jobs in the summer and, during off times. And eventually I took the union exam and got admitted to United Scenic Artists, which is the union for theatrical designers. And that kind of, and so I wound up doing this, even though this wasn't really what I had envisioned myself doing. So I think that kind of answers one of the questions you sent me, Emily, about, and I mean, now I'm getting close to retirement, and I'm kind of looking back and I'm beginning to go, maybe that wasn't the best choice for me to do that, but it served a purpose at the time. And of course, I'm not going to look back and go, well, I regret that choice. I mean, there's been some very rewarding aspects of it, but I think ultimately I would have been more content to be able to pursue that professional career. But circumstance creates that. It creates opportunities, and you kind of have to make those choices as they come along. So, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that just makes total sense when you feel like you're in one track and then you look back and you're like, wait, what did I just do? Right. But then you look to see like where you've come, and it's really cool. I didn't realize that not only as a faculty member on a scholarly track, like in the professional field, that you're still expected to do professional work. And that's, I guess I didn't really put two and two together for faculty members. So that's
well, and I talk to a lot of students, particularly in my classes, when they say, well, I really want to be a university professor. It's like, well, do you understand what that means? It's not, you don't just come in and teach your classes. For the faculty who are, and generally if a faculty member has a PhD, you can assume that they are publishing. It's that idea of publish or perish. And for me, it's not publishing, but it's, working professionally and maintaining those connections. And, and it's also the level at which you're working. Like, for instance, if I work locally, it's not, because we are a research one institution, it's not really considered, what you want to do is you're trying to establish a national reputation in your field, basically. Mm-hmm. And you have to prove that you've done that. I think that for to become an associate professor, I think it's a regional or national, and for a full professor, it's international. Okay. So, and it's your job to prove that you've done that. Okay. Through your vita, through the work you've done, through people that, and when you go up for associate professor, and become tenured, there are people from outside that are invited to view your materials and evaluate you in terms of what you've accomplished. So it's a really rigorous, difficult process to get to be full professor. And frankly, I don't think that was one of those things that I ever thought I would get to. So that was kind of an unexpected aspect of being on a faculty. Because I kind of always looked at it, but fortunately, the last dean we had really encouraged me to do that, to apply for that, and I began to realize I had done more than I realized, and I think he kind of felt that way as well. So,
Very neat.
yeah.
So you mentioned in high school that you were in theater and you wanted to be on stage, but like as a small child, what would you say was your dream job?
Well, I thought a lot about that, and I think I really don't remember having a lot. The one thing I do remember at one point was I I had this idea that I wanted to be an oceanographer,
Hmm.
and that was I I have no idea where that came from, and to this day, and the reality is I'm not very good at science and math. Those are not my areas of strength. My areas are history and literature, and right. So I'm not sure I could have ever survived. I doubt seriously if I could have ever done that. But for some reason, that there was something in that. Maybe it was the ocean and the sea, which I had never really seen that.
Hmm.
I mean, I never saw the ocean until I was, in my 20s. But there was something about that captured my imagination, maybe, right? I mean, when I was young, what we were watching was, we were watching the men land on the moon for the first time, and somehow in my head, those images felt like the ocean in a way.
Hmm.
And while I didn't want to go there, there was that ocean out there, and I was always fascinated by the sea creatures and the animals that existed in that environment. But that's the only thing I can think of that I ever thought about, other than, and frankly, how I wound up doing, because I came from a family that's from Eastern Kentucky,
Mhm.
who, when I was in high school, I had four brothers and a sister, so we were a fairly large family. Um, uh, my, I got involved in there was when I started high school as a sophomore, there was an English teacher who I think I had a huge crush on, right? She was my sophomore English teacher, and everybody, but it wasn't just me, it was like everybody in the class, right? We were, and it was just, there was something about her that wasn't that she was, she was very attractive, but there was something about her personality that attracted everybody to her. She was incredibly positive, and so she in the fall of that year, she made an announcement that they had just cast the fall play and they still had a small role that they needed to cast. And if there was anybody interested, they should talk to her. And I don't know why I just went up to her after. I guess it was because I thought, well, it'd be a chance to kind of work with her more in a different way. So I volunteered, and basically they were doing arsenic and old lace, and they needed somebody to be the dead body. And so I said, I'll do that, and then ultimately I also wound up doing a very small role in it. And I had never done anything like that. I didn't even really know what it was. And I look back now and I think to myself, it must have been a real challenge for my parents, I think. But my dad was he never questioned it. He just, he would take me to rehearsal. He would pick me up. And they were there. And so I got involved in that very heavily, and then it was speech, and it was speech tournaments, and it just really, I was one of those kids that was not in the mainstream. And so, all those people that were kind of like me were there, and, you just fit in. And so I just was, it was just like so much fun. It was not like anything I'd ever done. And to this day, I just wonder, my mother kind of fought it. At some point in there, I decided I wanted to learn to sew. Well, that really sent her over the edge. and and she just refused. We would just not, she's like, no. And so I was like, well, there's a pattern. How hard can it be? Right. And instructions. So I went to buy, I needed something it was a costume party for thespians. And I just went and I found a pattern. And fortunately there was a woman there who was glad to help me. And I was like, I don't, and so she helped me read the envelope to figure out how much fabric, and I took it home and I just started doing it. And she, and mother was in the kitchen grousing the whole time. I mean, just growling about it. And, and I finally, I was trying to put sleeves into this top, and I could not figure it out. I was just getting so frustrated. And finally she just said, give me that. I'll show you how to do it. And so she did. And then from then on, I just took off. And so then when I came to UK, that was part of, I had kind of started learning to do that. And I think that's ultimately, I think what I realize about myself looking back is that I like creating things with my hands. I like making things. I like putting things together. And and so that making part of the career has been a real important part, of my career and what I do. So kind of in a field, but
So you kind of covered some of the other questions, so I'm going to skip to what does a typical day look like for you in your position?
So again, I have to think about, well, all right, as a university faculty, it looks like one thing. Mm-hmm. But if I go to, when I've gone to do a professional gig, it looks very different. I mean, as a faculty member, I'm in class, I'm serving on committees, but I'm also designing or advising students who are doing that. So you have a lot of balls in the air all the time, right? And of course, this past year has just looked totally different for everything. When I was, now I'm more or less retired from the profession. I'm now moving toward retirement as a faculty member, and I'm kind of stepped back, and I'm actually now pursuing my own personal research, which I can talk some about in a little bit. But in the past, when I would be designing, a lot of times I had the theater I primarily worked for was in Florida, and it was a small LORT theater, which is League of Regional Theaters, and they were probably the lowest on that order of regional theaters, but they would. So they would fly me down twice, so I didn't have to be in residence the whole time. And a lot of the plays they were doing were new, world premieres. There's a lot of contemporary plays, so a lot of it was shopped. So a lot of times I would, it was all done virtually. It was all done. Of course, at that time we didn't have this capability, so it was done on the phone. I had created a website by then, and so I had a section where I could post preliminary sketches for the director to see, or we would fax things, whatever worked. But we were doing it long distance, and so I think that I learned a lot of technology skills doing that. I mean, I kind of learned to keep my own website up, which I don't really do now, but it was a way that I could begin to build that online presence, which I think today is vital, to what you're doing, to what anybody's doing, really. So a lot of times they would book me so that my residency corresponded with like for instance, I would be 2 weeks in residence, but 1 week of that would be the spring break here. And then I would get time off either on the front end or the back end of that. Or sometimes I would start the semester a week late and I would have been down there, or, so it always worked out that I didn't, I could, and frankly, they didn't really need me in residence, but, so once I would arrive there, then I was working. A lot of times it was shopping. I was out shopping. I go to fittings, the actors. You're just, as a designer, you're constantly. What I tell students is you're constantly answering questions. You draw the pictures, you get all the designs together, you give them over to the shop, and then you just answer question. All you do is answer questions. And what about this? What about that? And a lot of it is being. I always say, how fast you have to answer those questions is directly proportional to how close you are to opening night. So, if it's a week out, you can say, can I think about that? If it's the day before, it's like, okay, I got to come up with an answer now. And you really have to learn to think quick and fast and be on your feet, because a lot of times the shops or whoever, they can't wait for an answer. But that's the nature of my art form. Theater is kind of this in the moment. There's all this planning that goes on, but gradually, I always say it picks up steam and gets faster and faster and faster, and so you really have to maintain your cool and be able to get those answers out when people need them. Especially, I think once you get to dress rehearsals, and you're in the theater with everybody, everybody wants answers and they want them right that minute. So that. And I think I always liked that. I liked the interaction with I liked all the interactions with the different people, particularly actors. I think as a costume designer, you have more, you spend more time with the actors than you do really anybody else. And for the most part, I have always enjoyed those interactions, because really good actors, they love to entertain you. And they will, and so you're kind of constantly an audience of one in some ways. Sometimes they can be difficult. You can have people who are difficult, but you learn to. I think you understand that their actors are very vulnerable, because my teacher here used to always say, you never do anything to get an actor, because it's too easy to do. That's like the one great sin for her, was anybody that would do anything, to get at an actor, because it's not fair. They're out there, and it's, so I think that same vulnerability exists backstage when you're working with them. And it's not, I don't know that I can put to one quality that causes that in an actor. I've worked with some actors, they're so confident and nothing bothers them. They just, they have questions, they ask, they want to talk about it, but they don't have that kind of insecurity. I probably and I'll show you on the website, the woman, I kind of worked with a woman who's a star, and she was incredibly difficult to work with. But then you saw her on stage and you were just like, oh my gosh, she's unbelievable, and so somehow you kind of could forgive some of that, because you saw that the quality of what came out of her. At the university, my day is, it's like I'm teaching some of the time. I'm doing a lot of grading. It's class prep, committees that I sit on, or, and personally, I have always enjoyed getting outside the college and sitting on university-wide committees, because I meet people outside of the arts. It gives you a whole different perspective on the world. My favorite example of that was, and I've used it to this day, I was on graduate council a number of years ago, which reviews curriculum for the graduate programs. And that was pre-digital. It was just before digital was really starting. So we had all these reams and mountains of paper that we were, when you reviewed, so like if somebody was reviewing a piece of curriculum, everybody on the committee got the paperwork, because you were supposed to have input. And so we would wind up with reams of paper, each person at the table. And one day one of the faculty members spoke up and said, I really have to sit and say, all this paper seems like such a waste. It's like, I just think about all the trees we're killing. And there was kind of a pause. And this little man who had never said anything before, at the other end of the table, he piped up and he said, speaking as a member of the Department of Forestry, that's why we grow them.
Oh gosh,
And that was so enlightening. It was just such a funny moment. But again, but it was a little consciousness raising, because we were always complaining about killing trees. And he's like, I'm sorry, that's why we make them, is to make paper. So stop worrying about killing trees. You're not killing just random trees. You're killing trees that they grow for that purpose.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, and I think the other thing about my job is it never turns off. I work with people who they go home at 5 o'clock and they don't think about their job again until 8 the next morning. And that, I don't know what that experience is. I have never known that experience, because if I'm in the classroom, then I am, I'm grading papers or I'm grading projects. I'm preparing for projects. If I'm designing, I'm working on research. I'm researching. I'm doing sketches. Whatever. I don't know what that is. Now, I will say that as I'm moving into retirement, I'm beginning to take ownership of some of that time and say, no, this is not what I'm doing. I'm doing this now. So
yeah, that's great.
But I think that's the privilege of being full professor, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So what would you say is one piece of advice that you'd give a young artist or student from your past experiences?
I think it's just being open to whatever comes along, because you really don't know. I mean, I can use this example. When I was very young, when I was really just like right about the time I quit school in 1977, sometime right in there, I went to Southeastern Theater Conference with a friend. It was in Atlanta that year. And I was trying to find a job because I had quit school, and it was, I was going to have to get work. And I'd gone to interviews. I'd done interviews, throughout a couple of days. And it was an evening, and we were going, I think we were in the conference hotel, I'm pretty sure. And we were going down this escalator, and it was packed with people. And then there was another escalator coming up that was also packed with people. And as we were going down, I was talking to my friend, and we were yakking, and I looked over and I caught the eye of this man that was coming up on the other side, he was, I don't know, maybe in his mid 40s, I don't know. But he just made eye contact with me. And I mean, literally, he just did not break it. And I just, and we got to the bottom, and Dennis said, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know, but I'm going to go find out who that guy was. Well, that turned into a job that took me to Texas. And, and later he said, I don't know, there was just something about you that I couldn't stop. I was just caught up in your gaze. And so it turned into a job. So I think it's, and in the same way, and I worked with him for a number of years. He was a director at this big, huge outdoor theater. I designed the biggest projects of my career as a very young designer. Before I had gone back to school, I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of really on the job training, I think. And 3 or 4 years later, he had originally he had started out in Las Vegas, and that was one of those places that I always kind of wanted to go to, It was just like, I don't know, it was kind of like maybe being an oceanographer. There was something that fascinated me about that idea. And so he said, after it was like 3 seasons out, and he said, why don't you just come out? Just come for a visit, because I said, I've got a condo out there, just come. So I I bought a one-way plane ticket from Houston to Las Vegas. I had $100 in my pocket. And my friends were all just like, "Are you nuts? What are you doing?" I said, "I don't know, but I'm going." And I did. And it turned out, so I wound up being there for 2 years between there and Reno. I worked backstage at the MGM Grand Hotel. I did, I worked in a number of different places. And I really, again, it added to my career in a way I didn't expect. I mean, I got to work with some fascinating people. I had a lot of fun. It was kind of an amazing place to be. I just love the rhinestones and the feathers and all of that glitz that was there. And 2 years I worked, and I mean, it's not an easy place to work. I mean, you make good money, but the temptations there are very strong. And I saw a lot of people that succumb to a lot of that. And after 2 years, I just went, it's time to leave. And I bought a one-way plane ticket back to Kentucky, and I had $100 in my pocket when I came. So it all worked out. So I think you have to be open, and you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be willing. I don't know. I always, there's I don't know if you look at a tarot deck, there's the character of the fool. And if you look at that character, he's walking along with his head up and he's about to step off a cliff, but it's not worried about it. And I always kind of saw myself that way. It's like, just take the chance and go. And the reality is yes, I've failed, but I've learned from those failures and mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes, but for the most part, I wouldn't trade what I did, those choices that I made. So I think it's being open. It's just looking for, you never, you start out saying, well, I'm going to do this, but then this comes along and you go, well, maybe I want to try that. And actually I'm experiencing that right now as I move into retirement, because I'm ready to be done working in theater, and I've got this project that I want to do. And I'm transitioning to doing that. So it's just be open and don't be afraid to just go when the opportunity arises, or maybe if it doesn't arise, make the opportunity, I guess.
I love that. So what do you consider to be your most successful career move or moment?
Well, I would say that taking that risk that I took early, because I learned so much about it. Now, I will say the way he worked was not the way I think. He was kind of an odd duck, but he had faith in me that like nobody's ever had in me. I was like, literally, I was in my mid-20s. I was a little kid. And he said, there's something about you, I believe. He always had faith in me. And I think maybe that was the first time I ever experienced that in my life, that I had that kind of somebody that really believed in me and thought that because he talked about, he would go, God, you're so incredibly talented. And I was like, really? I just I had never pictured myself that way. And so I think that I have to say that's probably was one of the best things, because then that set me on the path that got me to where I am. The woman I studied under here, she also had faith in me, but it was not the same. It was more, she was much harsher. She was a taskmaster, and I appreciate that, because I think she kind of gave me a work ethic. That I already had, but she, basically you just, it was like, you have to do it till the job is done, because her favorite line, and I use this to this day with students, is like, you can't go out on opening night and say, I'm sorry, can you come back tomorrow? We're not done. because opening night's coming and you got to be ready to go. And if that means you're kind of, making do with some things, that's what you do, right? So
That's really cool. I've had experiences like that where you have someone almost as in that mentor role that has really believed in you or saw something in you that you just didn't see in yourself, and it really sets you up for success. I try and do that on a daily basis too, to give back. So, I can tell you do that too with your students.
yeah.
So what role does an artist like yourself play in our society?
Well, that's a hard one because I really I think in my as I've aged out, I've become a little bit cynical about that. I think that I mean, here's the thing. I think in my field in theater, I think what it's been good for me is because I create worlds that have nothing to do with my own experience. And I say this to students all the time. It's like I I can't think really of one play that I've ever designed that was like, oh yeah, that play's about me and my world and my right. And so it really forces you. Well, I think a good artist, good theater artist, it requires that you get in that person's shoes and walk around and try to understand that experience. Um, Again, the one example I use frequently is, ironically, in my career, I have designed a number of plays that deal with the African American experience. And I say to students, what do I know about that? Nothing. So in order to create a visual image that's truthful, it requires that you try to understand. Now, am I ever going to truly understand? No, I don't think so. But I have to put myself, so it requires reading and listening, and a lot of listening, I think, to try and understand what that experience has been for that particular group of people. And I've done that across the board. I mean, with all kinds of different people. Wealthy people, wealthy characters. What do I know about that? Nothing, because I'm not wealthy. I don't have that kind of privilege. I do have privilege, but not that kind. Uh, so you're constantly confronted. And I think that's as artists, I think as theater artists, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help the audience understand what that experience is. And it's different than a film because theater asks you to think. A movie, you go sit in a movie and yes, you can experience all of that, but you basically sit back and relax and just let it wash over you, because they tell you what to think. They tell you don't have to listen hard because they make it sound so loud that you can't miss anything. But in theater, you really have to engage. You have to intentionally become part of what's going on there. And so I think that's the role we play. It's to turn that. You hear this all the time. It's like, well, it turns a mirror on you. I don't think it's a mirror so much as it's like, listen and try to understand. Because sometimes yes, it does turn a mirror, but for the most part, it's listen and try to understand. Because I think it's easier to be empathetic when there's a live person up there as opposed to somebody, and what do they call it, an illusion on the screen, a shadow on the screen. It's like suddenly it's more real in some ways. Yes, film can grab you by the heart and rip it out, and they can really, it can have a huge emotional impact. But I think that when you really engage, that theater kind of produces that effect in a way that's a little bit more because you've become part of it.
Mhm. I
right?
love that. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Um, so what then
Should probably
encouraged
explain though why I've gotten a little bit cynical about
No,
before I move on.
that's such a great answer, and it's probably the only answer like yours has been a very unique answer compared to what other artists on our talks have talked about. They're talking about providing art for the public, and you're talking about helping people understand what it's like and to be empathetic and to really understand and put yourself in someone else's shoes, which you can do in other art forms. But you're right, being watching a live performance is it's something that I feel like everyone needs to experience once, at least once in their lifetime, because it's just very raw and you're right, it's more emotional because it's live and you're seeing them
Right.
in the moment. So and I love that you are like realize that you're not the expert and that you're listening and you're talking to people who know more about a certain topic than you do.
Mhm.
That is, I think, in our society, sometimes we forget to stop and listen. So
Well, I think if you're trying to be a storyteller, you can't tell a story that you don't understand.
yeah.
And that's I mean, that's all I do. I'm a storyteller. I mean, I'm part of a bigger group. I'm not doing it by myself, but it's I realized that very early on. It's like you can't you have to understand who the my teacher always used to say the question you have to answer is who are these people, what are they doing, and why are they doing it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the crux of it. And when you begin to think about that, well, how do I understand that? Because I don't understand the experience of that particular individual,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's great. Um, so this kind of leads into this, but what do you feel like encourages or inspires you in your job?
Well,
I
I think
don't
it's not
don't
every,
share
you know, not every project is like perfect, but periodically you have those moments when you, I mean, sometimes it comes from the applause. Sometimes it comes from meeting somebody new that you've never worked with before, and suddenly you make a friend for life that because so often, I mean, it's a little different here because I tend to work with the same people all the time. But when I would go out and design professionally, suddenly it's like, I don't know any of these people. Or maybe I know this one, but I don't know these. And so it's just, I think that's what early on in my life and my career that I was anxious to get out of Kentucky and go someplace else and go see other places and do and be part of other things. Um, and I think that's just kind of the same thing. It's like when you go to work on a new production, again, you meet all these new people. I meet actors, I meet people backstage, I meet some people that I don't have any direct working relationship with. They're working in other areas. But there's a lot of people. There are a lot of interesting people out there, and I think being able to um, have that opportunity to go and just be a part of something bigger than yourself. Again, meeting other people. So I think that's what encourages me, or what has encouraged me. Now, as I've gotten older, I'm getting less. I'm really wanting to do what I want to do, right? Because as a costume designer, I'm limited. Well, I don't like to think of it that way. I have to work within the vision of the director and the other designers. I mean, we're all working as a team, and I'm now to the place where it's like I really kind of want to just do my thing and do what I want to do. And I think my dad was like that. My dad hated his job. He hated it. And he could not wait for the day he retired. Now, I don't think I hate my job. I mean, I don't love it as much as I did when I first started, because again, over the years, you tend to get a little more cynical. But he could not wait for the day that he retired. And he made the most of it. From the day he retired, he did what he wanted to do, whether it was work in his shop, or read a book, or sit and watch an hour of football, or go out and work in the yard, or work on his garden, or travel someplace. And I appreciated that. I appreciated that he had that that he accomplished that for himself, and he planned his life very carefully to ensure that he was able to do that. So I think now, I think what encourages me is this project I'm currently working on that I expect is going to take me through till I die. I'm going to, I'm right now, what I'm doing is I'm figuring out what retirement's going to look like for me, and how I'm going to stay busy being creative, but creative on my terms for me, as opposed to satisfying somebody else's needs. Right.
That's great. Yeah, that kind of brings me to my last question, is what you want to do next and what are your current goals? I'm kind of interested if you're allowed to tell us what it is that you're working on.
Sure.
We'd love to know.
Well, because I began sewing and making things, and that's I still love doing it. I love working in my studio and doing that kind of work. So over the years, and today I was just thinking about this because I was cataloging, but I started thinking about that story I told earlier about going to the fabric store and getting patterns and making. I remember at the time being fascinated by that pattern that I bought, those patterns that the pictures on the cover. There was something about, you opened it up and the newsprint instructions and the tissue paper, and to me, it was just something magical that I could then take that and I could make something. And I didn't have to be limited to what the picture said. It meant I could just take my own ideas, and I could, and as time went on and I learned to manipulate them. And so I have now acquired a collection of sewing patterns that numbers around 7,600 units.
Wow.
And I have been for the last, I started about 20 years ago, but work always got in the way. I never could, and so I started cataloging them, and that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to create a database of information, because again, part of what I do is I'm immersed in history. I love history, and my work is you're constantly doing research. Sometimes it's old period, past periods. Sometimes it's even today, but that research and the history is really interesting. And so this collection, I have one pattern that dates to the turn of the last century. I have a number in the 1930s. The bulk of the collection is mid 20th century, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, kind of a wide swath of that mid-century. But and so it's the information that's there, because it's like patterns are like ephemera. They weren't really intended to last, but yet these things have lasted. It's amazing. Sometimes I open them up and I'm just like, I can't believe you're still here. And sometimes they're in really rough shape. Sometimes, it's like you go into one and suddenly it's like you're touching the person who had that the last time. You find pins in it. You find small pieces of fabric in it. You find receipts in them. You find there's all this, and it's so fascinating to me as I, try to restore these to a place where I can photograph them and get, the patterns themselves. Yes, eventually they will be fairly worthless because they don't, they're not, but there's certain information that I want to preserve that somebody, a researcher, somebody that can drape, they could look at the information and say, well, I can recreate this garment. I don't need the pattern. I can do this without it, right? So anyway, so that's what I'm doing. I think that there's a couple of books in there. I think I'm currently thinking, I've become fascinated with the idea of extant garments. These are garments that are survived that museums hold. And I think that if you took one of these patterns and you made it up in muslin, not tried to recreate it, you kind of are creating an extant garment of some kind. And so I'd like to do that and take it to the Costume Society and make a presentation. And I think that would get a big argument going, but it would be a good argument. It would be a fun argument to have with those people, and to, because you're kind of bringing it back to life in a different way. I got inspired. I was working with Dr. Ritter, a colleague who does a study abroad in London, and I was kind of working, she and I were doing it together. And I would go to, the big palace, like I'd go to Hampton Court and Kensington Palace, and they've started creating these figures in the rooms that are period garments appropriate for the room, but they're made out of paper and they're white, right? And so you walk in and they feel like a ghost figure in the room, and you get close and you realize, oh wow, these are made out of paper. It's not even cloth. And it's fascinating because suddenly it's this ghostly presence in these rooms, and it really adds, because they're not trying to recreate garments, because in the next room they have some actual garments. So how are you going to do that, for one thing, right? And so I would like to do those same things, but in muslin or some kind of cream colored fabric, because I think then, one, I don't want to sculpt in paper, but I love the feel of fabric, and to just create. So what I'm hoping eventually to do is to make a couple available to a couple of, I don't think a museum's going to pick up on them, but I think maybe places like Ashland or the Mary Todd, small places like that would, yes. And the nice thing is it's not a real authentic extant garment. So the cost to maintain it is minimal, because those kinds of things are, if you talk to museum people, to maintain those garments is extraordinarily expensive. But you would have that same kind of presence in the rooms that people are touring through. And I think so anyway, and I'm hoping eventually to be able to turn that into a small business where I could just sell those. But it requires, so before the pandemic, and I recently got married and moved into a house. I lost my studio, and we're trying to build one. I haven't been able to work on it, but before I did, I had purchased a form, and I had carved it out to make it the right shape for the period. And so I'm hoping, once I get my studio back, that I'll be able to kind of go into that. But I'd like to do that with these patterns, because I think if I were to do I'm thinking of a book on 70s clothing through these pattern covers, to actually make some up in muslin and have them in front of the cover so that somebody can see. And it's just an extension of what I'm talking about, I think. So I think that could take me through till, I keep me busy, and it's again, I think as I go on, I find more, ideas. Unfortunately, there are moments like I just last week, I documented the 7600th pattern, and it was the last one that because I got into trouble because I had an initial group, which came from my old mentor here, that was maybe 3,000, but eBay is a terrible thing. And so I started buying them. I started buying them up, when I would find them, because I just bought a collection last fall from a woman in New Jersey. She had I don't know how many she had, and I just finished documenting the last of those. So now I'm going back through the photographic files, and I have to start cleaning up those photos, and I'm double checking the database against the photo. So now it's kind of this very mundane, reorganization. So periodically I can only do that for so many. Like this morning, it took me 3 hours to go through one file and clean up just the titles, not even the photos. I mean, I have no idea what that, that'll probably make me insane. But
That sounds so cool. And just especially marketing that towards some of the smaller museums and historical houses around Lexington. Oh, I
well,
would,
I'd like to go, because there's houses like that all over the country.
yeah, yeah,
So, if I can get a couple out and get, I just need to do a couple, get some photographs so that I can start marketing that to some, some different, places. Because again, I think it'll be, they would be able to afford it, without it.
yeah,
I mean, they might have to plan for it, but, they certainly could probably get grants for that.
yeah. No, that is very, very, very cool. And just thinking about not having the upkeep, like you were saying, that it's not a historical garment, that
Right.
would be so much easier to keep it. I used to work in a museum, so just thinking like just having items available.
Well, right. I mean, they could take it off once in a while and send it to the cleaners and have it cleaned if it needed, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't
Yeah,
have to be stored at, this or that. I mean,
right.
eventually it would probably go bad, but it not for years, years and years and years.
That's so cool. Well, wonderful. Well, Joy, do you have any questions for Nelson?
Yeah, I know we're almost up to time, but I just have one quick question. I was curious, like, what your favorite period in history is to study, like whether that's in terms of like clothing or just like in terms of general historical events.
Well, it's interesting. Last fall I taught a class in period styles, and so it kind of I think it's hard to pick one. I mean, I've worked a lot in the 18th century because there's a lot of plays set in the 18th century, a lot of plays in the 19th century. Probably the one period that I've only worked in once was mid 17th century that I got to do, and that was kind of neat. Although the clothes are not particularly attractive then, they're just, and particularly for women, they're very confining and restrictive. But I think it's fun when I get a chance to work in a new period that I haven't done, because then it's like, even though I have an understanding of it, from a basic costume history course, you don't really get it until you start looking. The other thing I like doing is a lot of my research comes from paintings and sculpture. I really love seeing the clothing through the artist's eyes, especially and even like right now, I'm with my costume design class, they're designing Ghosts by Ibsen. And so I've been showing them, I've been trying to walk them through the process. And, Edvard Munch is like the go-to painter of that period from that region of the world. And, you look at his paintings, you think, well, there's not a lot of information, because it's kind of, expressionistic. It's not, but when you really start looking at it, you see there is information there that I think, and what I realized is if you look at late to mid to late Victorian clothing, it's also frilly and, it starts, but if you look at what he did in Norway, there's a spareness to it, right? It's almost, Spartan, for lack of a better word. And so I've become fascinated with how he interprets the clothing and how that would inform me if I were designing that production, right? As opposed to maybe what was happening in England or Russia or America, or right. So I don't think it's easy to say that there's a particular period that I like. I mean, I'm pretty, there's some times that are kind of ugly. But even those, you get into them and then suddenly you start to see a beauty to it that you didn't see before, I guess. So and since I've gotten older and I'm able to travel more, I go to London, I spend all my time in museums, visiting different locations to, because I love museums and libraries. And unfortunately, libraries are kind of going away. But here's the thing, digital, the internet, it's like I can now access libraries all over the world. And during the pandemic, I stumbled onto, I was looking for a book in the library, and I'm constantly going down rabbit holes like this. But there was a book I wanted, and I kind of didn't want to go over and get it, but I looked it up on, to see and I found that there was a copy of it online through something called the Hathi Trust. And because of the pandemic, they had opened up their stores basically, and anybody could access it. So I went to it. Well, oh my gosh, I spent a whole day like in this place because I can access like old periodicals from the Victorian period that are in other libraries all over the world, but not here, right? And they digitized it all. So it's just unbelievable the amount of information that's there. And so that has really changed. I mean, I still love going into a library, but I'm beginning to transition but now I have, Art Store is another good example, that database. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I send students to that all the time now. So, so many museums have put their collections online. It's true. It's not the same as seeing it in real life, but it's pretty close, especially because so many of them are, like on Art Store, the resolution of those photos are so high that you really can see details that, you think, oh, I have to see this in real life. But I would never want to give up being able to actually go to the museum or go to the library and look. But the nice thing is there's a lot of things that, I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. The Metropolitan Museum is not here, and nor is, the Victorian Albert Museum or, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And I think that's, for me, it's a great opportunity to be able to explore the world in a way that we never could before. So yeah, libraries and museums, that's my, and now I can go to all of them without even going to them if I want to. So.
Well, we are out of time, so we're probably going to have to finish now. So we'll have to have another session maybe when others can join us so we can view your website.
Okay, fine.
But I wanted to thank you so much for joining us. This was so interesting. When I was in high school, I really thought about doing costume design. So it's kind of bringing back like, oh man, that would have been so awesome and amazing to do. So it was nice to just learn more about your career and how you got to work on so many different things. But, sorry, my daughter is now ready for bed. But anyway, I wanted to thank you, and we'll make sure that this gets up on our website or in our YouTube so that we can share it with others.
That's fine. And my website is nelsonfields.com. So if people want to go and check it out, there's information, some of the work I've done, and my blogs from when I went to London for 3 years, and it's got a lot of information as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to share that too on our Canvas page. I think it's already up, but I'll make sure to reshare it once we have the link out. Yeah. YouTube video. So,
and it's off my bio page on the Fine Arts website.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
So we can get to it that way too.
Perfect. Well, thank you. We really appreciate you joining us and getting to learn more about you. So,
thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
Thank you so much.